All right, so part of our final exam, this is the coral reef ecosystem video, and I chose the following organisms from the interactive food web that we received. All right, so for the primary producers, I chose blue-green algae. It's autotrophic. It's a bacteria that contains chlorophyll, which allows them to be able to make and use their own energy. Um, it is benthic or pelagic. It depends on the type of species, but it inhabits objects and structures along the seafloor, as seen in this photo. So it attaches to coral. But then in some other species, which this is kind of typically found in lakes, but sometimes they have algae blooms on the surface of the water. Blue-green algae is also a plankton. It's a plankton algae, and it's technically a photosynthetic bacteria as well. An adaptation of the algae, it uses different types of the algae are able to control their exposure to sunlight. So depending on how much exposure they want, they're able to change their buoyancy, allowing them to increase or decrease their depth depending on the exposure that they want. And then benefits for the coral reef system, I found that the corals and algae both rely on each other. They have a symbiotic relationship. The algae photosynthesizes corals and receive that energy. And coral provides algae with structure and shelter. All right, so for primary consumer, I chose coral. Coral, we now know, is an animal, but I put it down as both autotrophic and heterotrophic. The polyps can catch nutrients and are able to digest them. They also rely on photosynthesis from symbiotic algae as well as a zooathylete or zooathylete, however you pronounce it. But that part is kind of autotrophic as well. But the polyps require the nutrients, so that makes them kind of heterotrophic. So I counted them as both. Coral is benthic. They can be found in warm tropical shallow water, and they anchor themselves to the bottom of the seafloor. They are plankton or nekton. With my research, I found that it's not really neither. It doesn't seem to fit under either category, just because they're not swimmers and they can't be pushed easily around by current. An adaptation that coral has, as we've seen in Chasing Coral, the development of their sunscreen kind of adaptation, but it's from their photosynthetic pigments and an increase in stress proteins and defensive enzymes, which allow them to kind of, I guess, like freak out a little bit, and they start to bleach and have that sunscreen look. Benefits that coral brings to the reef systems: they provide a protective environment for thousands of species and are the main producer for photosynthesis. Like we've learned this past week, coral reefs are basically the equivalent of the Amazon rainforest, just because of how much biodiversity it brings to our oceans. So for an intermediate consumer, I chose a Sergeant Major. They are heterotrophic. They typically consume on small crustaceans, algae, fish, and larvae. It is pelagic. They typically inhabit within reefs at the seafloor, or they can be found anywhere in the depths between 1 to 12 meters. They are also a nekton. They're a fish. They're able to swim independently against the currents. There are no major adaptations for the Sergeant Major, except for them being kind of aggressive, and they have the ability to determine their sex, which I found interesting. Benefits that they have for the reef is that they help the system in balance by cleaning off algae for corals, nutrients for coral growth, and maintaining reefs in the food web. All right, top predator is a black-tip reef shark. They are heterotrophic. They typically feed on small schools of fish like the sergeant major and various types of cephalopods and mollusks. They are pelagic. They can be found near reefs, or they can be found in reefs, near shore, and shallow waters, but they typically don't venture too deep. They are a nekton. They're able to swim independently and not be easily moved by currents. They're able to swim against currents if they chose. Adaptations that the black tip reef shark have is their coloring, which kind of acts as a camouflage. So them being darker up top blends in with the seafloor when looking down at the ocean, but then when looking up, if you're in the ocean, they have lighter underbodies and they blend in with the light coming in from the surface of the ocean. Benefits that they bring to the reef system is that they regulate fish populations as well as the prevention of overgrazing against the reefs. All right, so finishing up with our reef organisms or the decomposers, and I chose a queen conch. They are heterotrophic, but they also are a decomposer. They consume dead and organic material, decomposes and returns those nutrients back to the reefs, which corals can feed off of as well as other organisms. They are benthic. They are found in sea grass beds as well as in reefs near the sea floor. They can't necessarily swim, but they are considered a nekton because they do have a foot that is near the back of their shell, and they're able to launch themselves across the seafloor, and they're able to move that way. An adaptation that they have, there's not really any current major adaptations, but they are extremely rare due to overfishing, and their meat is very desirable. And they're also illegal in some U.S. states to either consume or fish. Benefits that they bring for the reef, they help control algae populations from overgrowing onto the corals. So this is my food web that I created for my individual organisms. So I feel like it's appropriate to start out with the blue-green algae, which is the main producer per se. So the blue-green algae, it brings the benefits both to the corals, the sergeant majors, and the queen conch. When the blue-green algae goes to the sergeant major, it gains strength from that. They eat that, as well as the corals. They use that for photosynthetic purposes. Then from the sergeant major, the black tip reef shark consumes them as well. But since this is our top predator, nothing consumes the black tip reef shark. But if you want to say consume in a way, more like decompose, if a black tip reef shark dies, then it will go to the queen conch, which the queen conch can then decompose the organic material from the black tip reef shark and then bring back those nutrients into the reef, which then, as that can also be applied to the sergeant major as well, can also go to the queen conch. And then a cycle within itself here is in between the queen conch and the coral. When coral dies, it goes to the queen conch. Queen conch makes those nutrients, gives them back to the coral. And then that's just one cycle within the food web itself. All right, some abiotic influences that I found in my research is light, depth, temperature, salinity, and nutrients. First off, light. Corals need moderate sunlight levels. They kind of want that happy medium. Too little light does not allow the zooxanthellae, I really got to break that word down, to produce photosynthesis, but then too much light can result in coral bleaching. Depth, with the factor of life, coral can only survive where there's light still penetrating through the water. This kind of goes with light as well, but it can be found anywhere from 30 to 70 meters in the ocean. Now with temperature, they prefer warmer temperatures to survive. When you think of coral, you think of the tropics, so it's going to be warmer water. And they typically prefer around 60 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Now with salinity, corals prefer about 23 to 42 parts per thousand. But anything beyond that can result in the death of the coral, which that's ocean acidification, and you can go into a whole whirlwind of that. Then finally, nutrients. Corals want low nutrient water. Too much nutrients results in algae growth and the gosh, I always want to skip the middle part. The zooxanthellae, that's it, cannot produce photosynthesis because the algae kind of blocks the corals from receiving sunlight and eventually leading the coral to die because they can't photosynthesize. All right, and now for onto our effects onto different branches of oceanography, starting out with geological. What we talked about previously was kind of biological, but now on to geological. Coral kind of prevents seafloor erosion. This is kind of a newer study that I found in my research, but there has been recent evidence near Florida, Bahamas, and Hawaii of seafloor erosion, especially near reefs. Reef degradation has led to an increase in depth of the seafloor. They've also found a difference between when looking at protected reef systems to populated reef areas. The protected systems show to have lower rates of erosion when compared to the human populated reef areas. And then coral cannot keep up with the amount of erosion at the rate that it's happening. So coral cannot reproduce enough to, I guess, it might be a little too far to say that coral kind of holds the seafloor together because there's a lot of other things going into that. But there is evidence that there is more seafloor erosion when coral is being degraded. All right, with chemical, coral reefs kind of moderate seawater chemistry with the NCP and NCC. So the NCP is the net community production. It's the measure of carbon respiration moved from the atmosphere to the ocean through that biological pump, which we learned way back first couple weeks of this course. And then the net community calcification is the balance between calcium carbonate production and dissolution. So how that kind of all works together, just tying those all together right now, is that corals produce calcium carbonate, and when they combine with carbon dioxide, they make bicarbonate, which helps reduce the pH level of water. And when they reduce the pH level of water, it kind of balances out like ocean acidification. All right, and then onto salinity. I kind of talked about this with my abiotic factors, but there is an increase in evaporation and is leaving more salt within our ocean because when the water evaporates, obviously it's going to leave the salt, but then only take the fresh water from the ocean. And then this results with too much salinity. It causes an imbalance in the osmotic pressure for coral, and osmotic pressure works when there's too much salt on the outside. The fresh water, or like I guess the freshness, is going to leave that, which can result to coral death. All right, physical oceanography. So coral reefs kind of provide protection for, I guess, us humans that live on the coast. But they prevent erosions for islands, beaches, shorelines from storm damage and storm surges. They kind of act as a buffer for most storms before they reach the coastline. But then, of course, this leads to damage, and there's also an increase in damage because there's an increase in more frequent and more dangerous isn't the right word, but more destructive tropical storms, and reef systems are being damaged from that. And waves from storm surges can break and remove coral from those systems.